Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Terry Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, and I want to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar on recycled content mandates. We're really excited to be presenting this webinar today. We still have a lot of people who are joining us, so I'm going to give another minute or so to allow more people to join us before we start doing the introductions. But we're very excited to have so many people interested in this topic and participating in today's webinar. So hold tight for another minute or so, let more people join, and then we'll get started. Okay, good afternoon. It's afternoon, at least on the East Coast. And welcome to today's webinar that's been co-sponsored by the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, the Northeast Recycling Council, and the West Coast Forum on Climate and Materials Management. We're really so excited to be collaborating together to present this webinar today on a topic that is near and dear to all of our hearts. I'm going to do quick introductions and a little bit about how to use the GoToWebinar platform, and then we're going to get right into the presentations. Before I do that, I want to just at least talk a little bit about, my name is Terry Goldberg. I'm the Executive Director of the Northeast Waste Management Officials Association, or NWMOA. My colleague who is another of the co-organizers of this webinar today, Lynn Rubenstein, she's the Executive Director of the Northeast Recycling Council, and David Allaway, who's with us and going to be presenting today. He is one of the leaders of the West Coast Climate and Materials Management Forum. Hopefully you can see a slide about the forum. So I just want to mention what the West Coast Climate and Materials Management Forum is. It's a materials management and climate forum that involves a collaboration of state, local, and tribal governments. It's really looking at ways to institutionalize sustainable materials management. Go back to my slides. I don't know why it disappeared. And develop tools to help jurisdictions with these programs. They've put together a number of resources, and they have a really excellent website. So I highly recommend that you check out their website. These are some of the toolkits and materials that you can find on their website. I'm not going to read all of that for you, but please check it out. And I just wanted to provide a disclaimer that they asked us, and this disclaimer actually applies both to the West Coast Forum, but also NWMOA and NERC, just to say that the fact that we're putting on this webinar is an educational event, an opportunity, and that the ideas and opinions and any of the information expressed through this webinar is that of the presenters and not necessarily that of the forum or NERC and NWMOA. NERC and NWMOA are also interstate organizations in the Northeast US. So this is a collaboration between both regions, the West Coast and the Northeast. And we're very excited to be putting on this forum today. So this is, NERC focuses on a wide array of recycling and waste issues and sustainable materials management. NWMOA similarly focuses on a wide range of waste issues, particularly problematic waste, but also hazardous waste and waste site cleanup and toxics in products and materials. So what I want to do is first explain a little bit about using the GoToWebinar platform before we get into the presentations. I want to urge all of the participants to use the question box. If you want to pose a question or a comment, that in your little control panel, there's a, toward the middle of the panel, there should be a row with a question in it, and there's a box, at least in my case, on the right-hand side with a line, a dash through it. If you click on that box, you can enlarge the question field, and then you can post your questions. We do have a handout. I just want to point out that we've made available one of the handouts today. This is a handout from NERC and NMOA. It's a press release that we issued on Tuesday. We issued a call for comments on a set of model legislation that we've been working on over the last 18 months for mandatory post-consumer recycled content for certain types of plastic containers, plastic bags, and we're welcoming input and comment from anyone who's interested in this topic to send us comments. If you click on that handout, you can see the link to the materials, the link to how to send us comments, and also a link to a webinar that we're planning in the next 2 weeks to talk about the model legislation. So since it's relevant to the topic of today's webinar, we thought we'd share that with you as well. So I'm going to introduce our esteemed panel today. It's really, it's quite a distinguished group that we've gathered here, and I'm really excited. These are folks who've been involved in these issues for quite a long time, and it's really great to have all of them with us today. Our first presenter is going to be Mark Murray. He is the longtime director of the environmental group Californians Against Waste, or CAW. For the last 32 years, Mark has been instrumental in helping develop and promote many of California's best in the nation waste reduction and recycling policies. Among his accomplishments includes the establishment of California's 75% waste reduction and recycling goal, implementation of California's container recycling law, which has an average of 80% closed loop recycling for more than a decade, implementation of California's e-waste recycling law, leading successful legislation and statewide ballot measure efforts to enact the nation's first statewide ban of single-use plastic grocery bags. Overall, Mark's efforts to expand residential and commercial recycling have helped to create waste diversion from just 5 million tons in 1989 to better than 50 million tons today. Key to success has been making the opportunity to recycle and compost as convenient as throwing away. Most recently, Mark has led the development and legislative enactment of first in the nation and highest in the world recycled content requirements, 50% by 2030 for all plastic beverage containers. So that's going to be our first presenter. He's really very experienced in this whole area. Our next presenter is going to be Steve Alexander. Steve serves as the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Association of Plastic Recyclers, the voice of plastic recyclers in Washington, D.C. It's a trade association whose members represent more than 95% of the processing capacity for post-consumer plastics in North America. APR serves the plastic recycling industry by providing technical and educational solutions with the goal of creating more good supply of materials for recycling and enhancing the quality of the existing supply stream. Steve is also the president of Resource Recycling, Inc., a publishing and conference management firm. It produces the Plastics Recycling Conference and Trade Show, and it is the publisher of 3 trade journals, Resource Recycling, Plastics Recycling Updates, and eScrap News. Previously, he served more than 20 years representing corporate and association clients on Capitol Hill and in state houses across the country, including 10 years with Eastman Kodak Company, where he specialized in environment, technology, and appropriations issues. He's a graduate of the University of Rhode Island and holds an MBA from Selinger School of Business at Loyola College in Baltimore, Maryland. Our final speaker is David Allaway. David has worked at the intersection of waste materials and environment for over 30 years. He is currently a senior policy analyst at the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, where he has pioneered several advancements in waste prevention and reuse, greenhouse gas accounting, sustainable consumption, and application of life cycle assessment. David served as an advisor to the Project Drawdown and the New York Times bestseller Drawdown, the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global warming. In 2019 and 20, he co-chaired Oregon's Recycling Steering Committee and then played a key role in the development and passage of Oregon's Plastic Pollution and Recycling Modernization Act, which was signed into law last year. He has a degree in physics from Carleton College in Minnesota. I want to make sure everybody is aware that we are recording this webinar, and NERC and NMOA and the West Coast Forum will be posting the recording along with the slides on our websites. NERC is usually first out of the gate to post the slides and the recording on their website. So if you want to have access to those materials, check their website first. I'm sure that Lynn will be really great about getting the slides up and available quickly. So without further ado, I'm going to make our first presenter the presenter, and we're going to the rest of us turn off our webcams. Again, don't forget to post your questions in the question box, and we're looking forward to hearing the presentations. Thank you so much, Mark.
Thank you. So I'm going to start off with just kind of talking to folks, and then I've got some a PowerPoint that I hopefully will be able to figure out how to show here. So I want to just kind of say thank you for the introduction, and just say that relevant to this discussion, for more than 3 decades, I have been involved in working with stakeholders, with policymakers in California to establish the incentives, the policies, the programs to build a circular economy, and circular economy for materials with the objective of really conserving energy and resources and substantially eliminating the need for the resources and the pollution associated with the consumption, the extraction, the consumption, and of materials. And in terms of reducing pollution, that really includes reducing CO2 emissions. We believe that we have to reduce the amount of material, that virgin material that we're generating. And I'm not trying to persuade anyone that that's the focus. You don't have to believe that or accept that to appreciate what our experience in terms of recycled content. So even if you aren't buying into that, I hope that this will be valuable to you. This experience in California, we've had some successes, we've had some failures, we've had a lot of false starts, and I guess the main thing is it's taken us an awfully long time to get to where we are. And but I would say that where we are right now is having a strong model for how do you advance and sustain producer responsibility for, I used to say closed loop recycling, but producer responsibility for a circular materials economy. And that means requiring the producers to be accountable for demonstrating and financing the recycling system, at least for the materials that we've been able to focus on so far. Part of that objective is to part of my objective today is really to assist others in maybe learning from our false starts, from our mistakes, and ideally accelerating the pace of implementation of these policies. Now, with this very large audience from across the country, I think it's a safe bet that while some of you are in states that have a very mature recycling infrastructure, mature in terms of collection and processing, universal collection, sufficient processing, and now you're looking to put those kind of final touches on in terms of ensuring that there's markets for the material that you're collecting for recycling, and ideally a way to finance that. That's great. I imagine that some of you are also in a state like the state that I am vacationing in this week, where there is just a patchwork of collection, virtually no processing of secondary materials, and seemingly little incentive for anyone to invest in recycled content in packaging. There seems to be a huge gap in this state that I'm in right now, which is very warm and beautiful, but seemingly backward when it comes to recycling. So I hope that, but I guess it doesn't really matter where you are on that recycling maturity spectrum for it to make sense to advance a model of producer responsibility for recycling. Honestly, the design of the policy, I'm going to talk about the design of the policy that we've kind of come to in California. I'm going to talk about the mistakes that we made in terms of getting here. But frankly, design of the policy is probably not going to be the barrier to implementation. I think we all recognize that political will is going to be the likely barrier. And I'm going to have a few things to say about that as well. So let me just kind of start with just, here's some lessons learned. Here's kind of where we didn't get it right, whether because we were wrong or because the political will wasn't there to get it right. And we began this effort in terms of recognizing that you couldn't just focus on collection. You needed to focus on market demand, market development, producer responsibility for financing recycling. We recognized that from the very beginning. And our original 50% recycled policy in California included producer responsibility, for producer financing, for market development. And unfortunately, we could never get to yes in terms of the implementation of those policies in those early days. In the early 1990s, California, along with Oregon, maybe a couple of other states, did advance minimum recycled content policies for glass containers, for rigid plastic packaging containers, and I don't know if anyone else did trash bags, but we did trash bags. We did some printing and writing paper. And at that time, we provided, in an effort to try to get the policies through, we provided too many options and too little accountability, and that equaled little forward progress. For our discussion here, I think the classic example of that was California's rigid plastic packaging container recycling law, which is still on the books, but I think at this point contributes zero value to recycling market development, recycling funding, and producer responsibility. This was, an early days policy of assigning rates and dates to the producers of non-food contact rigid plastic containers. And I will say that the original policy actually covered food content packaging, but a subsequent legislature eliminated that provision. The RPPC law suffered from providing manufacturers with too many options. For, you could do either recycled content, source reduction, reusability, or recycling rate. And the multiplicity of options, the difficulty in terms of enforcing whichever one of the options a manufacturer pursued, and the fact that all of that was such a costly administrative bureaucracy with frankly no funding for enforcement, meant that, and this continues today, on a every other year basis, our state recycling administration picks 300 names out of a hat and basically seeks a demonstration of compliance with the recycling requirements in the RPPC law. And the process of enforcement takes generally 12 months, and I'm hard pressed to point to any actual contribution in terms of recycled content, recycling value. Mostly folks talk about their source reduction and we're done with it. Another lesson learned, again, with plastic trash bags, with glass, is this idea of linking recycled content levels to what is reasonable to achieve. What is the marketplace able to produce? And we end up with this approach, we actually get stuck in a catch-22. We establish recycled content requirements that are achievable, and then effectively those recycled content requirements that are achievable don't end up moving the marketplace. They don't increase the value of the material. So in California today, we have had on the books glass recycled content requirements for 20 years, requiring glass manufacturers to use 35% post-consumer recycled material. They dutifully report their levels of recycled content. This is California glass manufacturers. Report this level of recycled content every year, and we have very fine-looking reports that show 35 compliance with and exceeding 35% recycled content, but the amount of recycled material that is used in the manufacturing of glass containers is less than the amount that we're collecting for recycling. And so the recycled content numbers are not high enough. They're not pulling material, and they've had zero impact on the value of post-consumer glass to the recycling infrastructure. So the rates are too low. They were very reasonable to achieve. They haven't been updated in 20 years. And the bottom line is that other than the very nice looking reports that we get every year, they're not doing anything to enhance the market for recycled glass. And they're certainly not doing anything to increase the value of recycled glass. Statewide in California, we have, for curbside recycling programs, we have a negative scrap value. Curbside recycling programs, even with this recycled content requirement, are continuing to pay to have the glass taken off their hands and go to strategic materials for further processing. I want to just skip ahead here to talk about the fact that we think we have in fact now gotten it right. And California's AB 793 by State Assembly member Phil Ting establishes producer responsibility for material recycling and sustainability in the form of mandatory recycled content on all plastic beverage containers sold in the state. All PET beverage containers, all HDPE beverage containers, all 3 through 7 plastic beverage containers. Everyone is accountable for achieving the same rates and dates. On and after, if not before 2030, not less than half the material weight of beverage containers has to constitute post-consumer recycled plastic. Beverage brand owners are solely responsible for demonstrating compliance with the state and I think that, you know, we kind of cross the Rubicon, so to speak, where in terms of how do you balance, how do you create an off-ramp thing? Say there's a, you know, global pandemic and recycling supplies are diminished. How do you continue to move forward? The brand is a provision, the is what we describe as an administrative penalty. We have to describe it as an administrative penalty in order for it a majority vote, but the bottom lieu of payment. If I'm a beverage manufacturer and I've fallen short of the minimum recycled content requirement equal to of material, I'm going to see if I can. All right. I'm hoping people are seeing that.
It looks good, Mark, but your audio is breaking up a lot. And I don't know what we can do about that, but go ahead, continue with your slides. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Are you seeing the slides or are you seeing me?
I can see both. So we can see the slides, so you can continue with your presentation. I'm just giving you a heads up that your audio keeps breaking up. I don't know what
Jerry, a couple of people are suggesting that if you turned off his camera, it would free up more bandwidth for the microphone.
Yeah, try turning off your webcam.
All right. Okay, so hopefully you're seeing this, the rates and dates. January 1st, 2022, beverage manufacturers required to use 15% recycled content, then increasing to 25% in 2025, and then ultimately 50% recycled content. Again, the idea here behind this is more than just creating markets for recycled material. It is ultimately making manufacturers partners in ensuring that they have sufficient material to meet this requirement. We have many other mechanisms in California for helping to offset the cost of recycling, including provisions of our beverage container recycling law. But at the end of the day, this is this policy provides the ultimate incentive for the manufacturers to utilize, to ensure that that system is working to get this material back to them. And if they have to pay in order to do that, so be it. Okay. So penalties, as I said, 20 cents per pound based on a shortfall in the amount of recycled material. You know, this is an even playing field way for all material types to comply. So let's say PET, but most producers of beverages in PET are going to be able to comply. The amount of material exists for them to comply with the recycled content requirement through actual utilization of the post-consumer material. But for 3 through 7 plastics may not be able to meet that requirement. They still have the same, just because they haven't invested in the recycling infrastructure to date, they will still have the same level of accountability, the same level of financial responsibility, an equivalent level of financial responsibility for compliance. This means that, you know, you don't have to limit yourself to those materials that are ready to go. And obviously an unintended consequence of focusing on materials like PET that are ready to go with recycled content is that you create a penalty, you create a disincentive for utilizing the materials that have a better recycling profile, that have already made that investment in recycled material. This is where we stand in California right now in terms of plastic beverage container sales and recycling. 2020 was not a great year for recycling in California, with recycling centers closing due to the pandemic, but still 68% of PET containers returned for recycling, 54% of HDPE. 3 through 7s were all over the map, but an average of 18%. There's not enough 3 through 7 plastic being collected for recycling right now and processed. Even if they have letters of non-objection from the FTC, the Food and Drug Administration, they're not going to be able to comply because their recycling rate isn't high enough. They will still be accountable through the payment of this 20 cent per pound penalty. For individual manufacturers, maybe they find themselves, they're a manufacturer in Florida that doesn't have a sufficient supply of post-consumer material. We're not asking them to acquire material and ship it across the country from California. Effectively, they will make an in lieu of payment in order to comply. This is a listing. We've actually, for the last 6 years, California has required beverage manufacturers to report the level of post-consumer recycled material that they were utilizing in their containers, as well as the total tons of beverage containers. This is just a picture for PET, and this is just the largest beverage producers, and this shows their rate of compliance in 2020. We're gonna have a new report coming out in the next month or so, which is gonna show compliance in 2021. But for the majority of beverages that are sold in California in PET, the manufacturers are already meeting the level of recycled content. In fact, the statewide average level of recycled content already exceeds the 15% requirement that goes into effect in 2022. It's not even, you know, some manufacturers are below the 15%, some are above. There are a lot of small distributors and producers that are still at zero. But all of them have an opportunity to comply, either by accessing the post-consumer recycled material or paying the in lieu penalty. So I'm gonna just try to conclude here by saying that this is an ambitious policy. Not every state is ready for it. Certainly, they're not ready for it because the politics aren't there. They're not ready because the material collection isn't there. And so I'm assuming that we may have some folks in the beverage industry out there watching the presentation today. And ultimately, I can say that it may have taken us 30 years in California to get to this kind of place of a successful, you know, producer responsibility for recycling in these containers. So it may have taken 30 years to do that, but we are seeing public support, policymaker willingness to ban plastic products. We're seeing that the willingness to do that in 1 or 2 or 3 years from the date these policies are being implemented. So my message to the beverage industry is that I think you're in a recycle or die moment. I think that if the producers of products sold in plastic packaging can't demonstrate recyclability, can't demonstrate closed loop recycled content in their products, I believe your product is going to be a target of a ban. If in California, then in cities, not in the entire California city, then in or the city of Los, we're going to have to find Los Angeles, huge markets where you're finding ways of delivering your product. It's not work California and Oregon, Washington, the East Coast to build a closed loop cycling system for your product of continuing to have the option of delivering your product in recycled plastic. So that's the presentation. Hope I didn't break up too much. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Mark. We're going to move to Steve.
Hey, I hope you can see my screen.
Looks good, Steve. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Well, actually, I think I'm going to spend a little bit of time here just as I go through the screen. Good morning, everybody, and thank you very much for taking the time to be with us. Appreciate Terry and her group and David's being able to put all this together. So we're the plastic recyclers. We're not the plastics industry, we're the recyclers. Without us, there is no recycling. And, you know, we're on the ground floor. And I think that I'll go through this presentation, and I'll also make some comments, basically outlining what Mark said. But I just want to give you, this presentation includes a lot about how APR has been committed to recycled content mandates. The first industry group that supported mandated content back in 2006. But I've seen a bit of a change in the narrative, and I'm going to be changing a little bit of our priorities in 2022 going forward. And I think it's been demonstrated by the current economic situation we're here in the United States. And that is, if we can't simply focus on the demand side of the equation. We're all about demand, but we've seen that right now, if you think about what's happened with current inflationary pressures that we're facing, because the administrative policies trying to help us all through this pandemic has certainly created a demand side for product and material. The difficulty is what demonstrates today is that we also need to make sure we focus on the supply side, because the impact that we've had on supply chain problems across our economy has led to great inflationary pressures, as we all know. I'm not telling anybody anything they don't know. And it's caused me to take a step back because APR and myself, we've been all about design for recyclability as well as market demand and mandated demand for the last several years. We need to also make sure at APR that we focus on the supply of material. I want you to think about this as we go through my presentation today. If you think about the recycling marketplace, it's very complex, it's multifaceted. At the base, the first thing that needs to happen of any product or any container, it must be designed to be recyclable. It needs to have circularity by design, because it doesn't matter how much material we collect, how much we separate, what the market demand is. Number one, if the product is contaminating the very stream of material that the recycling community is expected to create recyclate from to meet market demand. So that's the number one basis. The other secondary thing I'd like you to kind of play while we're going through this presentation is it's incredibly important. We must generate more good supply. We know that the systems that are in place simply don't capture the amount of material that's available for reclamation across the United States. We have data that shows in some communities with very robust curbside recycling programs, on an average, they have 77 pounds. Every household has about 77 pounds of recyclable PET in their homes on an annual basis. Yet on an average, only 25 or 27 of those pounds make it into the recycling stream. We all know we have 20,000 communities in this country, 15,000 recycling programs, and 9,000 take different things. We do a wonderful job, all of us, in confusing the consumer. If we're going to enhance the supply of material, if we're going to design, to be successful, we have to make sure we design products for circularity / recyclability. And then we need to enhance the supply of that material across the board. And we need to eliminate some of the confusion of consumers in the marketplace. And ultimately, that may lead to some winners and losers in terms of packaging and packaging types that are out there. But at some point, if we don't make significant changes, all we're doing is living the definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again, obviously, and expecting a different result. So enough of my pontification. Again, it's great to be here. Terry, I apologize for that very lengthy bio. It's an embarrassment, and I make sure I'll change that going forward. So let me see what I can do here and go forward. So this is what I'm going to present today. We're going to talk a little bit about who APR is and what we do. We're going to go over a couple of state laws, and then we'll talk about content in terms of EPR legislation, and talk a little bit about what APR does to try and enhance the supply of good material going forward. APR is an international organization. We like to think we're the voice of plastics recycling. We are the only North American organization that focuses exclusively on plastics recycling. This is all we've done for 35 years. It's not something we've recently come to because legislation has started to focus on plastics products, potentially banning plastics products. We're the technical soul of plastics recycling. It's all we do. Our primary goals are outlined here. We always are looking for increasing good supply, eliminating contamination by enhancing the quality of the material and demand. And we need to communicate the value of recyclate in the marketplace as well. Our technical programs, frankly, are the only things that are available absent government standardization in the marketplace. Our design guide is the most referenced authority across the globe for a company to develop a product or a container so it's compatible with recyclability. We take that design guide and we also offer training programs for consumer brand companies and other organizations. We customize those training programs, and we identify products through our testing programs, which are also the only programs absent government standards that can determine whether or not your product is compatible with recycling. And so our testing programs end up determining whether something is APR preferred, which means it can be widely recycled and it's consistent with recycling. If it's recyclable with a detrimental feature, which essentially means it might have something like a paper label on it, which we don't like. It comes up the system, but we'll deal with it, or not recyclable. So we're pretty consistent on that across the board. We do a ton of training. Obviously, we do a lot of communication. We have recently stepped up our advocacy statements and opportunity. We really haven't been an advocacy organization. We've been more of a technical advisor. But as the narrative around recycling has changed, we felt it's important for us to start ensuring that policies that are proposed actually help solve the problem. And then we do a lot to develop market demand for material. And we'll talk a little bit about our certification program, which allows companies to ensure that the material they're using is actually post-consumer material, and we certify that material. So, again, I contacted on this. And so we have there are content laws in place. Mark did a great job of talking through the 793 in California, which, California tends to be a bellwether state. And what we've done here, obviously, you've seen other states come on board. David's going to be able to talk a little bit later about Oregon. We've got Washington State that's got some activity going on. New Jersey's got proposals out there as well. And, again, as I indicated, we've been supporting since 2006. Again, however, the caveat here is we need to ensure that we're collecting enough material to meet these mandates. And a lot of that gets into making sure that programs are consistent in terms of the material and the products that they accept, the recycling programs they accept. And that labeling is important so that we don't confuse consumers in terms of what in fact is recyclable. We have been working with the Federal Trade Commission that is looking to repromulgate the green guides on labeling coming forward. And we have significant concerns about, frankly, the lack of specificity, because we believe the green guides could go a long way toward eliminating consumer confusion in the marketplace in terms of what is recyclable and what is not recyclable. And that's an ongoing activity. I'm sure it's not a surprise to a lot of people on this call that there are some members of this in the audience in the recycling world or in the packaging world that like as much flexibility as they can. But again, if we're committed to improving our recycling system and improving the sustainability of packaging, we need to make changes and be a little more strident in terms of what our requirements are going to be going forward. Again, I'm not going to go through these. I'm sure everybody's aware of these, and these slides, as Terry indicated, will be available for everybody. Don't want to bore you with all that. And again, David is going to go through the Oregon law. I apologize for skipping these through, but I think David is better positioned to walk through what's going to be happening in the state of Oregon. Obviously, Maine is the first state to enact an extended producer responsibility program. There's going to be a lot of attention focused on Augusta this year as they develop the implementation schematic for this program, going out to look to create a producer responsibility organization that will be in charge of running this. There are quite a few other states that are looking to this, and we are assuming that and anticipating that a lot more states will be following Maine's lead across the country this year, and we'll see much more EPR and producer responsibility type programs across the geography of the United States, as well as in Congress, obviously. We'll talk a little bit about what's going on the federal level as well. You've had in the last 3 or 4 years, there's been more activity on Capitol Hill and more focus in the last 3 years combined than in my 35 years of dealing with Capitol Hill. For a long time, we were a voice in the wilderness. Now what we're doing is we're trying to organize and filter and focus these types of policies. So in fact, they do provide these solutions that we need. We've talked a lot about the lead was the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which was initially led by Senator Udall, who subsequently retired, and now by Senator Merkley from Oregon. And then, of course, by Representative Lowenthal from California, who unfortunately recently has announced his intention to retire this year. So we're going to be looking for a new champion on Capitol Hill. And again, this is just an outline of some of the other proposals out there for your review and edification. And, absent and following this presentation, you'll have my contact information. I'm happy to talk to you about any of these. Again, what we try to do at our organization, just so you know, is we try to provide a technical input and almost an advisory capacity. We meet with the sponsors and we walk line by line through their legislation, and we'll say, okay, this will work. This might work, but you need to make these changes. This won't work, and we'll tell you why. And this actually conflicts with, say, an earlier part of your legislation. We want the policies to work, because the last thing we want to have happen, that we're very concerned about, is that there's all this focus on recycling right now for plastic products. We've waited a long time for this focus. If in fact you want policies to drive the solutions, what we don't want is a policy that is passed that sort of kind of gets at it, but it really doesn't solve the issue. And then we move on to something else and we've lost our opportunity. So we feel very strongly that we need to work very carefully and closely from a technical aspect to ensure that we're actually using this opportunity to address the real issues that we have going forward. Again, I talked earlier, we've spent a lot of time on focusing market demand. And I'll tell you why. If you think about the way the system works, a product is manufactured, a container is manufactured, consumer purchases it, they place it in the bin, it goes into a collection program, it goes to a sortation program, then it goes to preferably it goes to a recycler for processing. Up until that point in time, the system has been a cost. If you don't have a demand market, if you don't have a customer for your recycled products, all we're doing is collecting, sorting, and processing trash. So that's why we have focused so aggressively on demand markets for the last several years, because we believe as the material flows one way through the system, the demand component actually is the monetization for the system. We're not one that calls for a lot of government investment in this system, because we believe if you have a supply of material and you have the demand component, The infrastructure itself, the system itself will make the investments because they have customers. They know they're going to have a supply of material, a consistent supply, and they know they're going to have a consistent customer base. And so it all works together. You can't have one without the other. So one of the things that we are very clear about, however, is while we represent all plastics recycling, the issue we have with plastics packaging in this country is with material and containers that consumers touch and then either place in a recycling program or discard into a waste diversion program. That's what we need to focus on. We are not proponents of including post-industrial material in some programs because markets exist for that material. That's not where our problem is in society. So we focus a lot on the post-consumer aspect of it because that's what consumers see, touch, and feel. And so when we talk about circularity and when we talk about what's going on, it's a great term because it impacts the design of material, the labeling of material, the collection of the material, and the processing of the material. If you think about it, in graduate school, we had a term called garbage in, garbage out. If you're trying to create recyclate to meet market demand or regulatory requirements, brand owners ultimately are responsible for their own supply chain of post-consumer, of PCR, recycled content material, because they're creating the supply. So if you're not designing your product so it is recyclable, you're eviscerating and undermining your very manufacturing feedstock that you want us to provide content for going forward. So it is all, quote, circular as we go forward. So what APR has done, one of the things we've done is we are developed a PCR certification program because there's concern out there that when people use, quote, recycled content, are we certain that it's coming from post-consumer material? And so brand companies who purchase recycled content, they want to have certainty that the material they're purchasing from recyclers is in fact derived from post-consumer material. So we've developed the the PCR certification program. It's done through third-party auditors such as Underwriter Labs and others. And there's a chain of custody aspect as well. And then they are then provided a certificate that says that the material that they're selling to that potential brand owner or converter is at a minimum 95% post-consumer material. Why we think this is very, very important, let me just stay on this one for a while, is that from a labeling standpoint, we've done extensive consumer testing. And when a consumer sees on a package something is made from recycled content, they overwhelmingly think that it is derived from the material and the containers that they have placed in a recycling program. And so this provides that sort of integrity in the marketplace. It does not recognize post-industrial material. It has to be post-consumer material going forward. And one of the things that we've done as well is we've worked very hard to expand the paradigm of potential product applications for recycled material. I know a lot of folks want to go bottle to bottle or something along those lines, but there are many other uses for recycled material beyond, say, back into the same application. For instance, Waste Management now uses 10% recycled content in their roll carts. That's created a huge market demand. We have dunnage crates and slip sheets and plastic pallets that are made with recycled plastic material. One manufacturing facility alone who has transitioned from pressurized lumber pallets and transitioned to plastic pallets has, in fact, that one company alone has created an additional 2.5 million pounds of demand for recycled material on an annual basis. And there's all sorts of financial benefits. The plastic pallets last like 12 years versus 8 months, and those sorts. We have all those things. But you know what's important about all of this. Let me just talk about this for a second. When you talk about sustainability and sustainability commitments, when you talk about global climate change, when you talk about greenhouse gas emissions, we know, and studies have shown, that recycling plastic gives you the greatest return on investment for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, you reduce greenhouse gas, the greatest value in terms of dollar cost recovery for reducing greenhouse gas emissions comes from recycling plastics. And what's great about that is recycling plastics, participating in a recycling plastic program is something that consumers can physically do themselves personally in a very demonstrable way to contribute to a reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And we've got to publicize that a lot more as we look to grow our recycling programs going forward. You know, I've talked about design. I believe that's extremely important and very, very key across the country. And let me just close with this. We need to make some significant changes in terms of labeling requirements, what programs what different types of products are on recycling lists and recycling programs. We have got to try to eliminate some of the confusion that is out there for consumers in the marketplace. You know, I've been in this business a long time. My family's asking me all the time, is this recyclable? Is this recyclable? You know, even I don't know sometimes. So I think that, you know, that's one of the things we need to do in order to solve this issue. We believe that plastics recycling is the sustainability solution for plastics packaging in the marketplace, and we're happy to work with you going forward. And Terry, I hope that wasn't too long. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. I'm sorry, Steve. Sorry, I'm looking at David's name. I'm going to switch to David now because we definitely want to give him time to do his presentation. Go ahead, David.
All right, thanks. Can you see my presentation okay?
Looks good.
Great, thank you so much. All right, well, good morning or afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Terry and Lynn and the forum for co-sponsoring today, and Mark and Steve for some really excellent presentations. I'm going to offer a different perspective, and I want to be really clear up front that today I'm not disputing the ideas that Mark or Steve shared. In the absence of demand, there is no recycling. Indeed, it is the use of recycled waste in production where the vast majority of recycling's environmental benefits occur. And while the public refers to separation and collection as recycling, those are merely the start of a supply chain. Actual recycling happens at the end market. Mark and Steve's organizations are both doing some excellent work, and I'm going to offer some nuance and some somewhat contrarian ideas in the hope of making everyone's efforts in this space more effective. Okay, so I'm going to share two major ideas today, and I'll tell you what they are up front. The first is I'm going to point out some of the limitations of PCR mandates. And I do this in part so that other states that look to mandate PCR use go in with their eyes wide open and design their mandates in a way that avoids some unintended consequences. In the second half of my presentation, I'm going to suggest that there's a policy option that offers potential for better social and environmental outcomes. And that policy option is a particular flavor or style of extended producer responsibility, not a reimbursement only model, but a hybrid approach that assigns to producers responsibility for the creation and maintenance of responsible in markets. So now that you know my punchline, let's just look at the details. So first, I'm going to point out a couple of unintended consequences in PCR mandates. The first is that many states purchase items that are produced far outside their borders, and this introduces a disconnect between the supply of their recyclables, which is very local, and demand for materials that can stretch through supply chains that are thousands of miles long. If your state is large and home to a lot of producers, like California, a PCR mandate likely will provide a boost to your local market for locally collected recyclables. But if you're, say, Vermont, and the wine sold in your state is largely bottled on the other side of the ocean or the continent, then a PCR mandate for wine bottles will help collection programs on the West Coast. Thank you for that, but it won't do much for your locally collected recyclables. PCR mandates help the global recycling system, but not all recycling is global. There's also the potential that PCR mandates might not deliver the full environmental benefits that people assume they will. PCR mandates have the potential of cannibalizing existing end markets and creating barriers to better performing markets. And to explain this, I'm going to offer a couple of examples. My first involves glass. So there are many end markets that glass cullet can go to. It can be recycled via closed loop processes back into containers, or via open loop recycling into fiberglass, or an aggregate substitute, or it can be ground up and used to produce pozzolan, which is a substitute for cement in the production of concrete. These all meet some definitions of recycling, although there's a strong bias in the recycling community in favor of bottles back to bottles. Regardless, the environmental benefits of recycling are all about the market and the displacement of virgin resources and the avoidance of pollution and other impacts associated with converting those virgin resources into usable material. Not all recycling is the same. So how do these four options compare? This graph shows several different types of environmental impacts and the relative impacts of producing glass bottles and then recycling them into the four end markets I mentioned. And for comparison, the disposal option is shown in brown. Cullet to bottles is dark blue, fiberglass is Kelly green, cullet to aggregate is in aqua, and pozzolan is in purple. So a few observations. Cullet to bottles and glass cullet to fiberglass have very similar net impacts, which makes sense, because in both cases, the cullet is displacing the same material, silica, and the same primary process, which is the heating of that silica into glass. Recycling of glass into aggregate has lower benefits, shown here as higher net impacts, and that isn't surprising, given that you're displacing the mining and crushing of rock, which is a low temperature process that has relatively low impacts. But check out pozzolan, the cement substitute in purple. This appears to be the best option for glass recycling, especially from a global warming perspective, and there are two reasons for it. First, the recycling process for making pozzolan is primarily mechanical, not thermal. Glass is dried and then ground to a powder with minimal heating involved. There's less energy used and fewer emissions. At the same time, the pozzolan is displacing cement, and the production of cement is a very impactful process, especially from a climate perspective. So what does this have to do with mandates? Well, if policymakers follow convention and popular wisdom, and they mandate PCR in glass bottles, that would require the collected glass flow to that end market, and it would diminish the amount available to go to other markets. It could actually impair the ability of the nascent pozzolan industry to grow and gain market share by starving it of supply. That is, a PCR mandate that was limited to glass bottles could actually create a barrier to a lower carbon pathway. And this can be avoided by coupling a PCR mandate with an exemption if collected materials flow to a different approved market. That's exactly what Oregon has done with our state's statutory PCR mandate for glass. But lacking this kind of an exemption, mandated PCR content in glass bottles could actually have a perverse outcome by limiting our ability to respond to the unfolding climate emergency. A related dynamic could be at play for certain resins of plastics, and I hope Steve might provide some insight into this during discussion. For example, HDPE packaging can be recycled via a closed loop process back into HDPE packaging, or it could be recycled into other products such as drainage pipe. In order to recycle HDPE bottles back into food-grade HDPE bottles, additional processing is required in order to meet FDA standards. And that additional processing has an economic cost to it, a transactional cost, and an extra environmental impact. So a closed loop recycling mandate for HDPE bottles ends up delivering a lower net benefit due to higher impacts and higher costs than an open loop recycling option. Now, this might be causing some cognitive dissonance, because in both of these examples, I've suggested that closed loop recycling is not necessarily better for the environment than what is pejoratively called downcycling. And there's a lot of popular wisdom around downcycling, but these two case studies suggest that the popular wisdom might not be consistently supported by evidence. And I'd urge you to read this very important and short journal article by Roland Geyer at the University of California, which presents additional evidence that so-called upcycling and multiple loop recycling is not inherently or necessarily better than downcycling or single loop recycling. And let me explain. Imagine that you live on an island where people drink beer from glass, and the island produces glass bottles and cement. There can never be enough glass cullet collected to supply both industries, so you have to choose between them. If you direct your glass cullet to the bottle plant, then the cement industry has to source its raw materials elsewhere. In contrast, if you direct your glass cullet to the cement industry, then the bottle plant has to source its raw materials elsewhere. But here's the point. Neither option changes the available supply of glass cullet. Even if you recycle all of your glass bottles into pozzolan, you can continue recycling bottles in perpetuity so long as people keep drinking beer. The choice of an upcycling versus downcycling market makes no difference in the ability to continue recycling. So what is the justification for preferring or mandating closed loop recycling options? And I'd like to offer one last example then of where PCR mandates might not deliver the environmental benefits that people assume. Several years ago, I heard a presentation from some packaging engineers involving shoeboxes, and they noted that at lower levels of PCR, each additional gram of post-consumer content added to the box allowed for an avoidance or a displacement of an equal gram of virgin fiber. And that displacement of virgin resources is what the environmental benefits of recycling are all about. But above a certain point, adding more PCR doesn't allow for an equal reduction of virgin content, because PCR sometimes lacks the same engineering qualities. So if you force high levels of PCR into shoeboxes, you eventually just make the packaging heavier. You're not actually displacing virgin resources anymore. You're still recycling, but from an environmental perspective, you're not accomplishing anything. The same dynamic could be true for other engineered materials that have performance specifications, such as trash bags and some plastic packaging. And while it's possible to set PCR mandates at levels that avoid such non-beneficial use, that requires a degree of engineering analysis and technical review, like Steve mentioned, that is sometimes dismissed from the policy debate. It is intuitively reasonable that since 30% recycled content is good, then 60% recycled content must be twice as good, but it's not necessarily true. And the result is that government mandates have the potential, by picking winners and losers, have the potential of forcing materials into applications that don't deliver the environmental benefits that recycling could. Now, a poorly designed mandate can also be an administrative burden to implement, both on industry and on government, as Mark noted, because at its heart, a PCR mandate requires a regulatory agency to police producers based on the proportion of certain molecules that cross state borders in potentially thousands of different SKUs. Think about that for a minute. Mandates are often accompanied by exemptions and exceptions which can weaken or complicate implementation. And while state agencies are often reluctant to publicly criticize their own state's legislation, I've talked with staff in several states who tell me that their laws were not designed with ease of implementation in mind and have some truly regrettable loopholes. So I hope this helps to illustrate why recycled content mandates have the potential for unintended consequences and need to be designed very carefully. But let's pause for a moment and reflect on several other challenges that PCR mandates don't necessarily solve. And Mark and Steve both touched on these. It's widely assumed that mandates will increase the price that markets pay for recycled materials, and there's some good evidence to support this, especially with plastic. But it isn't a universal truth. Oregon has had a 50% PCR mandate for glass packaging for several decades, and much of the glass collected in this state goes to a local bottle plant. But the price paid has hovered around zero and has moved remarkably little for as long as I've been in this industry. Despite our state's PCR mandate, the revenue paid to collection programs at the bottle plant comes nowhere close to covering their collection or freight costs. And in many parts of the state, it's more expensive to recycle glass than it is to dispose of it. Our PCR mandate has not fixed that problem. On a related note, PCR mandates don't necessarily grow supply, as Steve mentioned, that is more collection. Now, if the recycling collection system operated solely in response to market prices, then economic theory predicts that an increase in the demand for a material would increase the price paid for that material, and that would lead to an increase in supply. But in this country, there's a bunch of factors besides price that determine whether a material gets collected for recycling. Again, in the case of Oregon, the supply chain, that is collection and processing, is heavily subsidized by residential and non-residential ratepayers. The revenues, the market signal paid by the end markets, only covered about 16% of the costs of our collection and processing in 2018. So that price signal is actually quite weak. Prices rise and fall, but it's a rare day when local governments respond with an actual change to their material acceptance list. So the recycling market and the balancing of supply and demand curves via equilibrium doesn't operate in the same way that most commodity markets do. So if PCR mandates are potentially useful but blunt tools of policy, and if they have the potential for unintended consequences, and they don't necessarily solve many of the problems facing the recycling system, is there an alternative? And we believe the answer is yes. The Oregon Recycling Steering Committee spent over 2 years exploring and debating the challenges with recycling and found consensus on a recommendation that became the basis of Oregon's recently adopted Recycling Modernization Act. It offers an alternative approach to the challenge of end markets and the failure of market prices to account for social costs. Although it's often lumped in with Maine's EPR law as one of the first 2 such laws in the US, the 2 laws have some important differences, and today I'll focus on one of those, and that is how Oregon's law assigns to producers a combination of financial and operational obligations. Now, the dominant narrative around EPR in this country right now seems to be that there are only 2 flavors of EPR. On one hand, the British Columbia model, where producers have or may have an operational obligation to the entire system, collection, processing, and end markets. And as an alternative, there's the municipal reimbursement model reflected in Maine's new law and the Recology ballot measure in California. And some people talk as if these are the only 2 options. Now, given that framing, the municipal reimbursement model is by far the most popular, largely because it protects the financial interests of waste collection and processing companies and avoids what would be a messy political conflict between those industries and the public sector. But Oregon's perspective is that there are more than 2 flavors of EPR, and in the case of the Oregon Act, the Act treats the 3 phases of recycling, each differently. I won't dwell here on collection because it isn't the focus today, but to note that the PROs will have a mix of reimbursement and operational obligations depending on the material. When it comes to processing, Oregon's processing facilities will retain ownership and control of their facilities, while producers will compensate specific expenses. PROs will pay a fee to the MRFs, and this fee will float inversely against commodity markets, such that the average cost to tip materials remains relatively constant. Ratepayers will be protected, and the destabilizing volatility of commodity prices will shift from ratepayers to producers. Basically, if a covered product is designated for recycling in Oregon, come 2025, the producers will have to keep the processors financially whole. And if it becomes more expensive to move that material to a market, the PROs, the producers, will have to make up the difference. Now, when it comes to the markets themselves, the creation and maintenance of markets is a function that Oregon's waste industry and local governments don't want responsibility for. So the Oregon Act makes the delivery of materials to responsible end markets a joint liability that is shared by the processors and the producers. This allows commodity markets to continue to function as markets and avoids the unintended consequences of PCR mandates. So long as the material flows to a responsible end market, one that delivers environmental benefits, the state is fine. The state's role here is to ensure that processors and PROs are sending materials to markets that meet standards for social and environmental responsibility, because the people of Oregon have a compelling public interest in the final destination of the materials they separate for recycling. And we can influence these destinations and outcomes through regulation of both the processing facilities and the PROs. This approach has not been applied to packaging in this country yet, but it has been applied to EPR programs for e-waste, so there is a precedent for it. I also want to point out that a comprehensive reform bill such as Oregon's Act also has greater and broader potential than a PCR mandate by itself. For example, Oregon's Act is definitely going to boost supply, collection, as a result of increasing collection services. And it's going to close the loopholes that have allowed for damaging exports of materials such as shown in these pictures. It will significantly improve the quality of materials sent to markets and address a number of compelling social equity issues. The Act will encourage the disclosure and reduction of environmental impacts across the full life cycle, and it's going to fund waste prevention programming as well. You see, EPR could be an on-ramp to upstream changes that are more impactful than recycling and recycled content alone. And in the content of our current climate emergency, we need policies that serve as on-ramps to bigger changes, as opposed to policies that are helpful yet essentially a cul-de-sac. PCR mandates by themselves accomplish few of these outcomes shown on this slide. EPR, coupled with a comprehensive reform bill, could. So to put this more plainly, a comprehensive reform of the recycling system, one that includes operational producer obligations with regard to the provision of in-markets, means that one can avoid PCR mandates and the potential administrative burdens of policing molecules as they travel across state lines, and the potential for higher costs and other unintended consequences. In contrast, a financial-only version of EPR may do little to nothing to ensure markets, much less responsible ones, and in those cases should probably be paired with some version of carefully designed PCR mandates. Now, I want to point out one last and related issue, and that is how some in industry, both the waste industry and producers, are actively promoting PCR mandates as an alternative to EPR, but their motivation is to divert momentum away from comprehensive system reform. Oregon encountered this dynamic firsthand when a large company funded what was essentially a covert attempt to promote PCR mandates to policymakers as a comprehensive solution to fix the recycling system. I say this was a covert attempt because this company went to a significant effort to hide its identity and to make the support for PCR mandates appear to be coming from leaders in the recycling and environmental community. My office figured out what was going on and stopped this scheme. But anyone on this call who cares about the future of recycling needs to understand that PCR mandates are promoted from some quarters not as a piece of the solution, but as a substitute for any other solution. And I know that the political calculus is different in every state. Sometimes you settle for half of your proverbial loaf of bread. But I just encourage folks to be thoughtful and go into these political conversations with full awareness of the dynamics behind them. Proposals for PCR mandates are not always what they appear to be, and in some states will likely result in an outcome where recycling gets better, but continues to struggle for several more decades, or until the next time that public interest and the political landscape allows for significant reform. And I would hope that we could do better than that. So that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. Lynn is going to handle the questions with the time we have left.
Yes, she is. Thanks, everybody, and great presentations, fascinating conversation and comments. Here's a surprise. We have a lot of questions. Let's see. Terry, are you hearing me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay. I'm going to turn my camera off because it seems to be stuttering. Okay, great. Well, there's still an opportunity for people to post questions, although we certainly have a number. So let's be sure that all the presenters are unmuted. I see that Steve and Mark still are muted, and I have questions for you. So something that was asked in a variety of ways, but multiple times, so I'm gonna start with that, is when we talk about PCR, are we including chemical recycling or just manual? So would love to hear from any of you or all of you.
Well, we include chemical, I want to make sure I say this right. Yes, if it's chemically recycled back into If it's post-consumer material, and then it is through one of the variety of chemical recycling processes going back into a product, and it's from post-consumer material, yes, we can incorporate that. We do not recognize chemical recycling of post-industrial material back into recycled content as recycled content for use in consumer messaging. We also do not recognize to fuel. It has to go back into a recycling application. And then there has been some concern about an approach called mass balance and some balancing because it has to be blended, etc. But again, any chemically recycled material must utilize post-consumer material back into a recycling apparatus that deals with consumer products. How's that for confusing?
Well, it was in depth. How about Mark for California and then also David for Oregon? Mark, I'm not hearing you.
Chemical recycling.
Go for it, Mark.
Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So chemical recycling, oxymoron in California right now. Can't count chemical processing of post-consumer material towards a recycled content goal.
Period. Okay. And what about Oregon?
Great. In the Oregon Recycling Modernization Act, the recycling goal that is specific to plastic packaging is recycling only. It does not include other forms of recovery, such as composting or energy recovery. Chemical recycling is allowed for, but if materials go to chemical recycling and are allowed by the state, there must first be disclosure of the environmental impacts of that chemical recycling pathway, and it needs to be demonstrated that the pathway is preferable to the alternative. So if the material is preferable and could be recycled mechanically and someone sends it to chemical recycling instead, no, that's not allowed. If the material goes to chemical recycling and from an environmental perspective, it would be better to put it in the landfill, then again, chemical recycling is not allowed. So it's more of an outcomes-based approach. It's agnostic in the debate between chemical recycling good, chemical recycling bad. Just it's another management pathway, and we want to know what the impacts are. So it requires some disclosure and then a decision.
Great, thank you. Another question we had several people ask, and it's a really basic one. I think it'd be important to hear each of your thoughts. Why do we have laws of these types? What's the goal? So is it markets? Is it litter? Is it climate? Is it something else? So why are we even considering these minimum recycled content requirements?
That's a great question. And I'll say that historically, you know, this is a policy that was really promoted and promulgated in the late 80s and early 90s. First, when thousands of municipalities in the state started collecting recyclables and they didn't have a market. And that was the heyday of when these policies were first really promulgated. The purpose was to create a market and to send a price signal that would make recycling collection financially viable.
Okay, and Steve or Mark, do you have a different perspective?
I concur with David. Yeah, I think that we started with this notion that we needed to create markets for this material that we were collecting. But I think really, as David said in his presentation, the objective of recycling is always been to, conserve resources, reduce pollution, and now we recognize that pollution as the existential threat of climate change. So in effect, the reason that we're doing this is because we are trying to conserve resources, reduce pollution in order to not be victims of climate change.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's sustainable materials management. I know David will laugh that I said that, but I think it's really the sustainable management of materials. And I think that over the years, when we first started recycling programs, the use of plastic products was more limited than what it is today. And then you have the implications for climate as well. So I think it's really about successfully managing the material stream.
Thank you. So, what I'm about to ask about, Steve, you alluded to indirectly in your remarks. So it's pretty rare to see a package or a product that flat out says, I contain post-consumer recycled content. So the questioner, and Lynn editorially agrees, says, then it becomes pretty hard for your average consumer to make that decision intentionally. So is there a solution? Is there something we could be doing to not just look at the mandates, but to be driving the consumer parallel to this?
Well, I think, there's studies that show that consumers select their package in 5 seconds when they go into the retail establishment. And, and I think we confuse the consumer. Right? I indicate that a great deal. And because we don't have standardized labeling, we have a lot of mislabeling that goes on that's out there. We actually are collecting, we get examples all the time when people say, this is, people send packages to us that says, recycle me, or, recyclable, et cetera, and we know, since we have the standards and the testing protocols, we know it's not. And so I think, I'm not sure it's responsible. I don't think it needs to be, we need to make it easier for the consumer. It's not their responsibility, in my opinion, to determine if it says recycled content on it, they need to understand what it means. When we tell the consumer to drive 55 miles an hour, they know what that means. Now, they might violate it, but they know there's a penalty for that. And I think that, we need to somehow create a system so that when a consumer sees something that says it's recyclable or has recycled content, it's made with recycled content, they know what it means. And I think asking them to understand today, I think that it's more upon us through either our testing programs or our design standards to try and eliminate that confusion for the consumer.
Hey, Terry, I'd just like to end here. I'd be really leery about labeling on this topic, and here's why. A couple years ago, we completed a review of thousands of comparisons in the LCA literature comparing packages with recycled content against those that don't. And what we found was if you have 2 packages made of the same material, PET and PET, recycled content is an excellent predictor of reduced environmental impact. But if you have competing materials that are different materials, recycled content is a lousy predictor of environmental impact. You could have a heavy package that has 50% recycled content, and you could have a lightweight package that has 0% recycled content. But if that heavy package weighs 10 times more, it's going to have 4 times more virgin content in it than the lightweight one will, the one that has no recycled content. So going back to first principles, if the goal here is to reduce climate impacts and reduce pollution and reduce natural resource depletion, recycled content is a pretty dicey indicator to be used in public messaging.
Well, I think just let me add this, and unfortunately, I've got a hard stop because this is not an easy issue. Plastics recycling can be very technically complex. But to David's point, there's one brand of water bottles out there, these plastic bottles, that through source reduction, it takes 42 or 43 of these bottles to use a pound of plastic. There's another brand out there, through lack of source reduction, that only takes 14 bottles. And yet they're both dealt with sort of the same recycled content requirements, et cetera? Are we recognizing the elimination and the source reduction of those types of materials out there? So this is just sort of the conundrum that we face and the complexity that we face. And, you know, sometimes for every step forward, you end up taking 12 steps back. And I think that's the difficulty that we're facing. The good part of all this is that with all the focus on what's going on now with plastics packaging, that, you know, there is a lot of activity and a lot of research that is driving a lot of these technological solutions. It's a very technologically focused industry. And, you know, we're seeing that with not just optical sortation, we're seeing that with new labels. You know, we're on the verge of dealing with black plastic material, et cetera. So there's new technology coming out every day. So, but, you know, are we where we need to be? No.
Thank you. So I hate to cut people off, and apologies to the audience because there are a lot of really intriguing questions out there, but we are out of time. Great conversation. I really want to thank each of you most sincerely for the fabulous work that you've done in your careers and for sharing that with us today, and to all of the sponsors that help make this possible. Terry, do you have any last words that you wanted to share? Otherwise, we'll say good afternoon and thank you.
No, I just want to echo your thank you to all of the presenters and all of the participants in today's webinar.
Wonderful. And the recording and presentations will be posted on the NERC and NMOA website. And with that, we'll say have a great afternoon, everybody, and don't get sick. Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.